Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another instalment of Revisiting, where I look back on one particular album. So I've decided finally to plunge into looking at the first 5 Squeeze albums, which I've yet to do on my channel, amazingly, given that they are my favourite band of all time. So today we will look at the debut album called Squeeze. In America it was called UK Squeeze because there was already a band called Squeeze out in America somewhere. Amazingly, later on when they toured Australia, they had to call themselves UK Squeeze again because there was also an Australian Squeeze, believe it or not. So they'd chosen a very popular name. Anyway, this was the first record they made. It came out in 1978, featured what is meant to be Arnold Schwarzenegger on the cover. I think he was Mr. Universe at some point, wasn't he? So I've never actually seen that confirmed in writing, 100% certain that it was Arnie, but it's meant to be. So there's him on the cover doing his muscleman routine, and on the back you've got the first classic lineup of Squeeze all posing as muscle men. So you've got Glenn Tilbrook and Chris Difford, the two main songwriters, Jules Holland of course on keyboards, Gilson Lavis, drummer, and the original bass player Harry Kukuli here, and he's the only member who has a tattoo. So this record had a very interesting genesis, and I have talked about this before actually. Years ago I did a video about this, but just to recap very quickly, it was produced by John Cale of the Velvet Underground, and that was largely because of his friendship at the time with Miles Copeland, Squeeze's manager. Miles Copeland, of course, being the brother of Stuart Copeland from the Police. Miles Copeland looked after the Police and Squeeze, got them both signed to A&M. John Cale was sniffing around the punk scene in the UK. I think he was fairly strung out at the time. He was looking for an in, really, into the British punk scene. He wanted to get a hold on there. He'd already obviously been in the Velvet Underground, so he was kind of seen as being almost a sort of godfather of punk in a way, and he produced a couple of notable punk records in America. He produced a couple of singles for Miles Copeland on his label Deptford Fun City. I think he produced the Cortinas and a couple of other bands. So really he was given Squeeze to do by Miles because I think Miles Copeland, who'd signed Squeeze, had spotted that Squeeze, who were from South East London, potentially had a bit of a punk image or a kind of punk style, which he tried to get them to work hard at. Squeeze were not a punk band. They'd formed in 1974 in South East London, Chris Difford and Glenn Tilbrook being the two songwriting mainstays of the band, and they had come up really in the pre-punk days, but because they were quite young and they had a kind of Beatlesy way with a songwriting hook, it wasn't that difficult for them to sell themselves as being punks, even though they were not. And Squeeze were possibly the ultimate example of a band who hitch rode onto the kind of new wave and punk scene really, without really being punks. So that's what happened. Now Squeeze had been gigging around South East London for a couple of years, and they'd built up a head of steam. They built up a following, and they'd also built up a load of really good songs. And John Cale, when he came in and heard the songs, wasn't too impressed by them, and essentially he made them throw out most of the stuff they'd written. He recorded an EP with them originally, the Cat on the Wall EP, which did have 3 Difford and Tilbrook originals on it, and that was a bit of a punky kind of EP really. That was on Deptford Fun City. And then he was brought back to record the album once Squeeze had been signed to A&M in 1977. But as I said, he made them throw out most of the material, and he wanted them to do something a bit edgier. He leaned on Chris Difford, the band's lyricist, to write stuff that was a bit more smutty, a bit more X-rated. He wanted them to, or he wanted Chris to experiment with some topics that were maybe a little bit outside Chris's realm of experience, really, because Chris had grown up writing songs really inspired by the Beatles and the Kinks, and he was a fan of certain other things. He was a big King Crimson fan. He was a big fan of Lou Reed. To an extent, he'd already established his lyrical style, which was to write observational songs with a sort of sense of humour. He definitely had romantic leanings, which John Cale was not interested in at all. So essentially Cale said to him, you know, write about write about kinky stuff. He actually told him, write about musclemen. That's where the whole kind of theme came from, of the musclemen on the cover. And the song in question that Chris ended up writing was Strong in Reason, the third song on side one, which he sang, which is a great track. It's very new wave sounding. It's got this really cool kind of organ, and it breaks out into this quite heavy chorus, really, for Squeeze. And it has this really nice intro with some really explosive drumming from Gilson Lavis. There's a couple of other quite smutty songs on here which Cale might have had a hand in. Out of Control is basically a song about leering at underage schoolgirls as they come out of school. Not the kind of song that you could get away with these days. And in his early days as a lyricist, and you know, John Cale might have had some blame for this. Chris ended up being attacked quite a lot in the music press for being sexist, for being misogynist, and we'll get into a bit more of that when we come to the Cool for Cats album, but you could certainly accuse that song of being a little bit that way. Out of Control. Sex Master, the opening song, which is a really great, very fast, very sort of punky, new wave, power pop kind of song, is basically a compendium of saucy personal ads in kind of, you know, sex magazines, basically.
Frustrated client thinks the man of the world must be frank and know his head really well. And give me a lesson 'cause I'm willing to learn. Where do you cut round and where do you burn?
And the lyrics are very fast, they're very hell for leather. It's kind of hard to hear what they're singing about, what Glenn's singing about. But again, you know, there's sort of references to electric erections and hand jobs, and you know, it was all very smutty. It was all very Benny Hill. This was something which definitely Squeeze were going to carry over into the next album, Cool for Cats, once they'd freed themselves from John Cale's influence. So it's quite interesting that you know, maybe he'd had a hand in that early on. But essentially what happened with this record was that they had to dump all their songs and write new ones in the studio. And as a result, you know, it's not really a classic debut album. It's a band trying to please the producer, really, by doing something that they thought he wanted them to do, rather than doing what they wanted to do. There was a kind of compromise, quite a deep compromise that went on. Although looking back on it, Glenn Tilbrook now says he actually finds the album quite interesting to listen to, because I think he felt that John Cale had pushed them into some interesting areas. There's certainly a couple of songs which are quite far out, really, for Squeeze. There's The Call at the start of side 2, which starts with a kind of tape recording of somebody shouting, "Bring out your dead," and this sort of tolling bell. It's all very sort of medieval. I mean, really strange vibe. And that goes into this really explosive Gilson Lavis drum pattern, and then into quite a hard-edged song, really. Quite a punky, abrasive song. The guitar textures in it are very like what the Velvet Underground were doing on their second record. They do have a very kind of tangled barbed wire-like quality. And then Hesitation, Rule Britannia, which is the second to last song on the end of side 2, that also has that sound as well. It's very abrasive, very punky. The vocals in that song are quite shouty, and some of the lyrics are quite dark. They're to do with suicide and people pegging out, and you know, it's really nothing like what Squeeze were going to go on to do. By the next album, they were writing songs like Up the Junction, and you know, they had a more kinksy kind of approach by then. But it does make for an interesting listen. And what is quite cool about the record is that Chris and Glenn were able to inject a little bit of their magic into the tracks. So you've got the song Remember What, which is the third song on side 2, which is a really great Squeeze song. Basically about a guy who's been out on the town the night before, he's got really drunk, and he just has no memory of what he's done. So the whole song is just him trying to remember what's happened. You know, there's vomit in the sink, and he's lost his shoes, and, you know, various things have happened, and he's just got no memory. Very similar to, there's a Nick Lowe song, I think, isn't there, from around this time, which is a very similar kind of theme. Take Me I'm Yours, of course, was the big hit of the album, really, which they did after John Cale had left the sessions. That and Bang Bang, the second track on side 1, those two songs were done after John Cale had gone back to America, I think. And Take Me I'm Yours is a real Squeeze classic. I mean, they still open their show with it. It's a sort of drum machine and a kind of synth part. It sounds very Eastern, very modal sounding, and it's just got this great lyric, and just the wonderful twin octave range vocals that Chris and Glenn had, with Chris doing the low voice, Glenn doing the high voice, you know, with an octave pitch in between them. So they're not harmonising, just a kind of combination voice, really interesting. It's sweet sounding, but it's also got that sort of gruff underpinning and just that really great lyric. You know, I've come across the desert to greet you with a smile. My camel looks so tired, it's hardly worth my while. What a great opening couplet for a, you know, for your first debut single. Absolutely fantastic. And it was quite a sizable hit, and I think it really showed the band that they could progress onwards without Cale after they'd done this record. And famously, John Cale made the sessions a bit of a misery, really, because he was completely off his head. He would do things like, you know, he would crack a whip in the studio. He locked them all in the studio one day and wouldn't let them out until they'd swapped instruments and recorded a note-perfect version of Amazing Grace. You know, I don't think Cale and Squeeze were a match made in heaven, really, and they certainly never worked with him again. And but as I said, I think they did feel in later years that it had made for quite an interesting record. So the other tracks we haven't talked about, Bang Bang, which was the second single, that was the other song that Cale had done. It was a bit of a fast power pop song, quite slight really for Squeeze, nothing too special about that one. Bit of a sort of energetic performance, I suppose. You've got While Sewerage Tickles Brazil, which was definitely a John Cale track, improvised in the studio, I think, largely. And it just has some really strange, weird sounds. It sounds like the Shadows on Bad Acid, essentially. There's this sort of weird, strange effect on the guitar, very sort of Hank Marvin, but it's really dark and strange. All this high-pitched screaming. It was the Canteen Girl, apparently, was called in to do some screams in the studio to make it sound like some kind of awful, I don't know, attack. It was, again, you know, nothing like Squeeze we're ever going to do again. It's quite a fun track, I don't mind it. Model, which was quite a nice Difford Tilbrook song, that's the second song on side 2, which was remade as the B-side of the Cool for Cats single a year later, is a great track, actually. It's got a real, again, a bit of a new wave vibe to it with a really catchy chorus. And the only other two tracks we haven't mentioned, we've got First Thing Wrong, which is a bit of a pub rock track, really. Nothing too special about that. It's just a bit of a boozy, down the pub kind of song, quite bluesy, a little bit Ian Dury-esque maybe. And then Get Smart at the end is just this very, very fast, punky power pop song with Jules Holland's organ. Squeeze were never a punk band, and the sound of this record, you know, it's not really punky. It's too sort of keyboard led for that, really. Jules's Farfisa organ is always present, and the guitars don't have that kind of loud visceral thing that bands like the Jam had. It's still a record that I'm quite fond of. I don't go back to it very often compared to some of the others, but I'm still quite fond of it. It was the second Squeeze record I ever got. The first one I got was Cool for Cats. That was the first one that I had, and then about a year later, or maybe 6 months later, I discovered this one in the racks at the record shop. It was really good because it was kind of working backwards, you know, discovering you've got this new favourite band, and then you discover actually the record that you've got was not their first one, and then you find the first one. So that was good fun. That was Squeeze, or UK Squeeze, depending on where you're from, and I'll be back soon to look at Cool for Cats. Take care for now. See you soon.